So this is Jo Meehan, Professor of Responsible Procurement at the University of Liverpool, and you are listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Well, it's great to be co-hosting this Making an Impact special with Amy, our guest host for this episode. Jo and Steve, we're really pleased to be speaking to you today. We're delighted to speak to you about delivering impactful research with public and third sector organisations. But before we get started, we like to get to know our guests a little bit. So could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you've arrived at the role you're in today? We'll start with you, Jo.
Okay, so I'm Jo Meehan. I'm Professor of Responsible Procurement at the University of Liverpool Management School. And my background is originally in industry. So I was a buyer for 11 years for ICI, big chemical company, and made the switch from industry to do a PhD, where I looked at power in buyer-seller relationships, and started originally at John Moore's, where we were doing lots of impactful work, and then moved over to Liverpool about 12 years ago.
Fantastic, and thanks for joining us, Jo. And it's really great to be on this podcast today. We wanted to talk a little bit about some of your research that was specifically developed into a REF impact case study in 2021. I wondered if you were able to summarise that research and talk a little bit about the partners who you worked with on that and the impact that it has had.
Yeah, so this research, it's quite broad, and it did sort of take over my life for a while, I have to say. And when I try to explain this research to people, they're always a little bit, really? That's research? Aren't these organisations doing this already? So in essence, my research is looking at value-based procurement. So procurement is, buying things from other organisations and thinking about how we buy, why we buy, who we buy from, and how we evaluate those commercial deals. And increasingly, we are pushing for this move away from just getting good commercial deals that can have lots of unintended consequences to people and the planet, and really trying to think about value-based procurement. So this is where we start to recalibrate what value and good means. So it might be we start to integrate, certainly in the case of social housing procurement, social value into our decision making. So how do we make sure that the things that we buy help the communities that we serve? And whether that's in terms of buying from our local economy or from ensuring that we don't do any harm through our procurement, and that we keep good, sustainable supply markets through what we do. And in the case of the health service, who we also work with on this impact case, it's ensuring that patient outcomes are considered alongside what we buy. So it's not just about buying cheap products or good commercial deals. We need to consider those patient pathways too, and those patient outcomes. And on the face of it, everybody goes, yeah, absolutely, we buy into that. Why aren't companies doing this already? And it sounds, in theory, really easy and really obvious. The problem is we're not starting from a blank page. We've got lots of embedded commercial practice, and we've got lack of transparency in our supply chains. We don't always know the impact of some of our procurement spend, certainly those wider impacts. And it's very hard to unpick some of the systemic inequalities that are resulting from our procurement, whether that's from government policy that's pushed us in a particular direction. To go against that is actually really difficult. So our research was trying to almost make the case for why we need to do it. What's the moral imperative for why we need to do this? And then trying to untangle operationally, what does that really mean on the ground? So it's all great in principle, but when you start to look at, well, what needs to change, we start to realise actually there's some really fundamental changes just to get what is, for some people, a really obvious thing that we should be doing anyway.
Thank you. That's such a fascinating topic, and I think certainly something that a lot of people, I mean, probably during the pandemic, people have heard about procurement quite a lot, but you're talking about it. I can hear from a, broader concept, and that idea of, I guess, coming at research from a more moral or different standpoint, perhaps, than people might traditionally think of where you start to think about research projects. And was that something for you that has always been a big part of being a researcher?
Absolutely. I would like to start a revolution, but barring that, I do actually really care about responsible procurement, hence my professor title, Responsible Procurement. And procurement does get a bad rap. As you say, it's been in the news an awful lot, particularly during the pandemic, and often for the wrong reasons. And what we can do with procurement can have really profound consequences on society, on health, on education, on our communities. And it's really about caring about where that money goes and how we use it. And it's not just about using local supply chains. That might be part of it. It's actually a bit deeper than that in terms of considering human rights through our supply chains, thinking from the NHS context about patient outcomes and health outcomes, and not just fixing something as we go along, but trying to systemically understand, okay, how do we not just do this procurement better, but how do we make the whole system fairer? How do we start to distribute value more fairly? And how do we even get to understand the right questions, not just what the answers are? How do we ask the right questions? What are we not seeing? Where are our blind spots in our supply chains?
And I mean, there's two things that I would love to pick up on there. I mean, firstly, I think it sounds like, particularly for your research, the way you think about things, you are looking at the whole, as you say, the supply chain, but from the beginning to kind of final impact and people being directly affected by procurement. So how have you gone about kind of conducting that research and finding the right people to work with and the partners that you have?
And that was a really important consideration, and we probably didn't do it strategically when we started. So when we started this research, we started doing case-based research. We were involved in a number of KTPs, so knowledge transfer partnerships with case organisations. Other organisations we just had existing relationships with through our own networks, and we were doing a bit here and a bit there, and we said, oh yeah, it can apply here as well. I started to understand the problem really, and really start to uncover the nuances and the complexities of that political environment that weighs really heavy on public procurement. And we realised that there was a real desire by organisations to use our research, and the questions that we were asking, they were going, exactly, this is the question that we need to ask, and we need to know the answers of how to do it. We all want to do it. We want to be inherently good through our public procurement. We just don't necessarily know how to do it, because we've got all these external political pressures that are pushing us in a direction that's not necessarily aligned to social value or patient value. So we could have tired ourselves out doing 1,000,001 different case studies, and we decided that wasn't really the best leverage point to get impact. So when we started to see actually our research can really change how organisations operate their procurement and the impact it can have, we started to think a bit more strategically. And in the case of social housing, which is where we did our first piece of work, we work with Procurement for Housing. So Procurement for Housing are a procurement consortium, and they essentially procure on behalf of the social housing sector in the UK. And there are a number of different consortia around. Certainly in social housing there are. PFH, Procurement for Housing, was one of the largest. And I actually had some existing relationships with that organisation. And we approached them and said, we think we've got some interesting research. We know it needs some more data. We need some more testing. Can we work with you? And it revolutionized basically what we did with that impact, because they had a much deeper leverage point to affect change. So rather than us doing company by company in these very small little case studies, all of a sudden we had reach and scale. So because they were buying on behalf of the whole of the UK social housing company, and I think they reached something like 95% of social housing spend or social housing properties, they got this really big reach. We could affect a bigger change on that industry. So we worked with Steve and his team and his commercial team, his procurement team, to say, you know, what is our research about? What is it that we're finding that's new? And things were pointing to relationships, collaborations, what we measure, a huge piece around data and transparency. And Steve and his team started by doing some little tweaks to things and going, okay, so maybe we need to put a little patch on here to fix that part of our supply chain. And then they quickly realized, actually, we need to be much more root and branch change to what we do. So they fundamentally changed everything from how they recruit staff to how they train them, to their policies, their processes, their procedures, and the services that they offer. So they started to create new services around data and invested in data aligned to what we were saying they should be doing in terms of value-based procurement. So they took it on and they created a commercial product essentially off the back of our insights. And that allowed us to really change the trajectory of that whole sector. And one of the really nice quotes, we held some round tables, I'll talk about this in a second. We held some round tables with some of PFH's clients. So these are social housing organisations. And one of them said, this is just how we buy now in the sector. And at that point, I thought, yes, we are really making this impact. And that was probably like one of my proudest moments of when somebody said that. And in terms of that mapping, that impact, so to stick with social housing for a second, we knew very early on that we were going to make an impact. And Steve was just amazing in terms of giving us access to their clients, to their processes, their policies, and was just open and listened and said, let's have a conversation, let's have a debate, let's pick out the things that we can actually affect change on. And that not all of the things that we said in our research were impactable, but they found those things that were. And they then implemented them with their clients. And in terms of understanding that impact, one of the challenges that we really had when we started to think about the impact case was we knew working with Steve, we'd had this commercial impact. We knew, and the figures were quite staggering. It was something like £100 million worth of saving that they could document from when they'd made these changes in their services and their policies and their practices. So we knew it had this huge commercial impact. But there was something niggling me there going, well, our research is saying we need to balance social impact as well as commercial impact. It feels wrong just to measure it in commercial terms because that's really not the point of it. The point of it was using that commercial efficiency to drive social change. So we were then going, well, how do we measure that? Because that's one step removed from the people that we're working with at Procurement for Housing. That's the social housing organisations who benefit from these commercial savings that Steve and his team make. What are they doing with these savings? Are they doing anything at all? Are they just, using the money to be more profitable? Are they doing something valuable? So we, to try and get to that and to get this sort of like golden thread of this is what we said, this is the problems in the sector, this is what our research said, this is how we've disseminated that. So basically we did talks up and down the country, any social housing event, we were there talking, we were in every publication to get this message out about what needed to change and why. We then held some roundtable events and we invited some of PFH's major clients. Now bear in mind, they've got like over 1,000 organisation clients, we couldn't invite them all. but we picked those ones that we knew had really embraced this new way of working, and were doing some things in the sector. And we invited their CEOs and heads of procurement and said, here's where we are, this was our research. And there were some of them were saying, oh, yeah, we didn't know that had come from your research. We just knew it was a brand new service and it was brilliant. That's great to see this. It's actually based on real evidence. Wow. So that was a nice moment. And then we said to them, okay, did you use these services? Did you see a difference? They're going, absolutely, we did. And I said, so what did you do? Did you feel this saving? Go, yeah. What did you do with that money? Oh, we can tell you exactly what we did with that money. And they then told us what they did. So some of it was about reinvesting in new social housing. So they built new properties. Some of the organisations said, we actually ring-fenced all of those procurement savings and invested in them back into our stock. So we gave our tenants better kitchens, better garden fencing. We invested them in community projects, back to work skills development, and we helped them negate some of the rent increases. We give them financial help. So we could actually see where this money went. And we use that as a method through our case study development to track this impact beyond our client, our commercial research partner. It was this, what then? What, and then you could continue, I guess, what was the impact of this on people's life and well-being? And so that's the approach we took. We took a slightly different approach with the NHS because they came to the party a little bit later, but built on some of those principles about getting the organisations that we're working with on board with what we're trying to do in terms of impact and having impact on the agenda through our research meetings.
Gosh, it's so inspiring and so wonderful to hear you talk about all of that. And I think the connection that you have with those different partners and those organizations, and as you say, keep asking that question of, okay, well, how did that actually have an impact? What was it that has made a difference then from our research? And you mentioned there that that's about that golden thread, creating that golden thread. And I wonder, you talked about that being your approach when you design and think about this research project. So if you're thinking about, I guess, others who want to be able to generate or replicate research that has a similar impact, or think about creating that golden thread, what do you have as advice, or how would you summarize how you did that
there's a few
as a process?
a few things I've learned along the way. The biggest sort of eye-opener to me was we because we think in papers as academics, we do a piece of work, we have some outputs, then we move on to the next project. Moving away from that paper by paper approach to really thinking about our work as a body of work. And that, again, it's one of these things that sounds really obvious when you say it, but when you're in paper by paper, it's hard to see that. And what I hadn't quite appreciated was just how much expertise and knowledge and insight we were gathering that didn't necessarily fit in our papers. Because when we're writing academic papers, they're written for a different purpose. We're talking about theoretical contributions to knowledge and generalizable insights. But some of the nuance that we were absorbing was still really valuable. And they were often the most valuable bits for the people we were working with. So it's being able to look across your work and find those patterns and those themes, and what are the really fundamental things that join all these things together, and how do we share that? And don't just say to clients, go and read one of our papers, because they're not going to do it, and it's just in a different, inaccessible language. How do we have a debate? One of the things that we did quite actively was have a dissemination pathway that we thought about really carefully. So when we started to realise that, there's some real impact happening here, but there was quite a bit of, not resistance to change, but the problem was quite difficult. And it was difficult because it was deep into our systems that we didn't always see. So it wasn't necessarily a priority. It was difficult because it was possibly taking us away from the government policy line of just aggregate all your spend. We're going, actually, that's not the way to do it. It has some unintended consequences. So we're going to get up against some really powerful policy directions of travel. And we also had this, well, aren't we doing that anyway? And people didn't actually realise that they weren't doing it until they saw some of the nuts and bolts of why our approach was different. So we had lots of resistance. So we had to, the whole hearts and minds thing, we had to tell public procurement, certainly in social housing and the NHS, that there's a need to change and what that change entails. So our dissemination pathways was lots of articles. We wrote millions, I think we wrote something like 70 odd articles for the professional press in those targeted in those areas, all around what our research was saying, why we need to change, let's have a discussion. We did talks at any event that would have us where we could get a platform to talk about the importance of this and really try to build momentum and spearhead us at the heart of that debate. And in terms of the golden threads, to go back to your question, what was quite hard was keeping hold of that, because we have our research that we know what our research says and what those messages are, but it's never this linear. We said X and the company went, hey, we'll implement that. It's never that clean. We say some stuff, they go, that's interesting, we'll have a debate about it. And then we will also ask other people, and we will also be constrained by a set of factors that you might not be aware of. And then other opportunities might come along that might supersede what you're saying or shove us in a different direction. And when you start to look at what they've changed, the golden thread starts to fray at the edges, and it's not very golden. It's, may not be shiny gold anymore. It might just be a dark yellow. So we start to lose its definition because it's diffused into these organisations. And the biggest thing I had to learn I realised something about myself, that I'm a massive control freak. And I don't like to let go of my research babies. I was going, but this is really important. The research said you should do this. And they're going, yeah, interesting, but we're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it this other way. And giving up that control was a big learning point for me. And what I realised there was I don't do the impact other people do. And I think because I'd come from a practitioner background, my natural instinct was to try and do the impact. And realising that isn't my job was quite a big eye-opener for me, but helped me suddenly. I had all this capacity going, no, I don't have to do that. That's somebody else's job. My role is to facilitate that and to be this sounding board and to provide the evidence for why we're suggesting certain ways. But the thread phrase through those links in the chain, and it doesn't necessarily look like what your research said. And that's where it gets really hard when you're writing up a case study. And that's why these roundtables and workshops were really useful, because we presented our research at the beginning of all of them and said, just to remind you, this is what we said, this was our evidence. And then they were making up the links for us.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, those are kind of almost those anchors, aren't they, to kind of bring you back to be able to keep that thread moving along. I'm not going to stretch that metaphor any further, because you know it much more than I do. I did want to say, it sounds to me as well from what you've said, and it's, you've got a huge amount of experience, as you said, as a practitioner, but also as a researcher and a very successful academic. You talk a lot about, working with other people and the way that, there is those challenges in managing what you're basically trying to do is influence change in others, and in the way that, they work in their practices. Are there, specific skills or kind of behaviours or things that you have learnt about yourself that you think are, vital to being a good, impactful researcher?
Yeah, academia at its best is always a team sport, and impact has to be a team sport. And recognising what other people can bring to that team and building that team of really good people with very different complementary skills. So some people are just really good at writing and translating that research. Brilliant, get them in the team. Some people, not me, are really good at project and relationship management. Use them because you need to manage these relationships actively. They change and they evolve, and they need to be really well managed. And that's possibly not a skill that we teach enough in academia, but it's absolutely crucial to make that impact happen. The big learning point for me in terms of skills was questioning whether I care about the impact or whether I care about my association with it. And that's hard because it goes to our ego. We're very egotistical, aren't we? So sometimes impacts have been made and I was going, but that's my research and they've not referenced it. Why haven't they referenced my work? Oh, please reference us. And I had to get my head around, actually what really matters is they've made the changes. That's the most important thing, not whether they've referenced our work in this or not. But yeah, collaboration is absolutely critical, and spending a lot of time on that collaboration so you understand each other's worlds and what matters. And that really helped us, particularly with the NHS as well, get impact on their agenda. So they became essentially our impact managers. They monitored the changes, they ran pilot studies, they fed those results back to us, and they did all that for us. And they kept the thread going for us, and told us also when it veered off course. So actually you said this, but we're going to do something different for these other reasons. This is interesting. How about you help us with some research in that direction because we're moving into uncharted territory. So it did allow us to develop a listening relationship, and our research shifted in response to some of their challenges, which kept that impact going.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you so much, Jo. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you and talk about your research, and just what an incredible kind of way to link both the your research and also that real world impact that you have. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Jo. That's been fantastic, really interesting conversation. This podcast is called the Developing Practice Podcast, and we like to finish each recording with 2 or 3 take-home tips that the listeners can reflect on in terms of their own personal practice. So if you could give us a couple of tips to reflect on in relation to designing and evidencing impactful research, what would it be?
Right, okay, that's actually quite a difficult question. Tips: design impact in from the start. Really think about who it is you're trying to affect change on. What's the purpose of your research? What's wrong with the world? What are you trying to fix, change, improve? And for me, one of the biggest tips was finding those leverage points. Where's the biggest impact you can have? And that means that you start to work with a different partner, or you'll disseminate your research in a different way. So finding those real leverage points that give you that scale and reach. Designing in impact from the start, thinking about, because impact doesn't just happen. There's a bit in between that's the dissemination bit. And my advice is be in listening mode when you're developing your research, because it's very rare for you to do a piece of research and then you go out and tell people about it and they go, oh, brilliant, we will change as a result. They need to be part of defining what the actual problem is. So we often need to be in reactive mode to the issue that they see and fit our research to that. So start with their problem, not your research.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jo. It's been great to talk to you.